Today's daf is daf Nun Dalid, and we'll begin with Tanur Rabbanon, which is on the bottom of daf Nun Gimel Amid Beit. Just 1 second, maybe we could put this on mute. Okay.
Yeah, you unmuted me.
Okay. Tanur Rabbanon. Now, we remember that in two cases of Menachos, we bring chametz. That is the shtei lechem on Shavuos, as well as one category of 10 lechamim out of 40 of the carbon toda. Ein machmitzim, here we're on daf nun dalid, bitapuchim. They used to use the juices of fruits, in this case, the juices of the apples, to add it to the dough, and it would cause the fermentation of the dough, the leavening of the dough. And the Brisa records machlokes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel as to whether or not we're allowed to do this in the case of the dough that's used to bake the lechem of those two karbonos menachos that we mentioned before. The Tanakama is of the opinion that the fact that you added the juice of an apple into the dough does not make the dough into chametz. And this is really a sugya psachim about what's called mei peros ena machmitzim. In any event, if, let's say, you cause the leavening of the dough simply through the juices of the apples, then it would not qualify as chametz, which is required for these two karbanos. That's according to the Rabbanon. Whereas Rabbi Chanina says, yes, it does qualify as chametz. Now, the question is, who exactly is this Tana? How do you identify him by name? Who says machmitzim? Rav Kahana Masnile Rabbi Chanina ben Tradion. Okay, so we don't know if it's Rav Chanina ben Gamliel or Rav Chanina ben Tradion. Now, the Gemara wants to take a Mishnah which deals with the issue of Truma and see if we can extrapolate from that Mishnah something about this machlokas that we just mentioned. Kiman azlo hadisnan, which of the two shitos in the Tanoim is reflected in the Mishnah that says that tapuach sherisko unesono b'tocha iso v'chumtza harezu asura. You have truma, which obviously cannot be eaten by a zar, and you made a dough out of the truma, and then you took the juices of an apple or crushed apple to leaven this dough. And the Mishnah says harezu asura, meaning the zar is not allowed to eat this dough, meaning it still retains its status as truma. And this is a Mishnah at the 10th parak of truma. And the basis for the issue here as to whether or not harezu asura or not is bittul. And the question is, if, let's say, you add something to a mixture and that something would not add any taste to the mixture. It's not a nosein tam, but it's a davar hamachametz. It has a certain significance of its own. So you have here this juice of an apple or the crushed apple that has the status of truma. And now you have a dough that is chulin, it's not truma. And now you used the crushed apple to be machametz that dough, And the Tanakama here says in this Mishnah that Arezu Asura, meaning it's not batel, even though relative to the volume, there's very little truma in this mixture. But since the truma is a davar hamachametz, therefore it's not batel, because the davar hamachametz, like a davar mamid or a davar shabiminyan, it has a certain chashivus that afilu be'elif lo batel. Kiman lema kirabi chanina ben gamliel hivelo kirabanan. According to the Rabbanon, there's no chimutz to create a real bona fide chametz by adding apple juice into the dough. And therefore, if this apple juice is truma, it would be subject to the law of bittul in the dough that is chulin. But according to Rab Chanina, we're going to have here a chimutz process that's recognized by the halacha as chimutz, and therefore the truma, which in this case is the crushed apple, is a davar hamachametz, and that's why harezu asura, the non-Kohen is not allowed to eat from this dough because this dough was leavened by truma. And the Gemara says no. Afilu temer Rabbanon, even according to the Rabbanon, who hold that in the case of Menachos, where the Torah requires chametz, then if you were machametz it through the crushed apple, it would not qualify as chametz. That's only because nehi de chametz gomer lo havi. It's not real full-fledged chametz, but rather it's a lower level of chametz. And this is what we discussed yesterday on Daf Nun Gimel, that, and we were discussing the sheet of Reb Meir there, that whether or not chametz nuksha is called chametz, and the fact that if you eat it on Pesach you get malchus means it is chametz. Again, it's not chametz gomer, but it does pass the line of chametz. And if it qualifies and identifies as chametz, and therefore you get malchus on Pesach, then it's a davar machametz with regard to hafkas bitul in a case of a davar machametz that is machametz ki chametz nuksha, the dough that's chulin, and therefore the zara is not allowed to eat the dough. And that's something that even the chachamim could agree, because when you're talking about the carbon mincha that requires chametz, then you require chametz gomer. And therefore, if you crushed an apple as a davar machametz in a dough, it would not qualify as chametz gomer, and you have not fulfilled the mitzvah of the mincha. But as far as qualifying for either chametz nuksha on Pesach to generate a lav, or as a davar machametz to prevent bittul in the case of truma, in those cases, even the Rabbanu would agree that you've passed the bar and you do have something that's called chametz, although it's not chametz gomer, and that's enough to be mafkia and undermine, neutralize the bittul, and the truma is not batel in the chulin, and it's enough to generate an isur lav of chametz nuksha for achila on Pesach. Amar Av Ilah. Okay, now the names here are important, so we have to try to remember the names. Ein lecha hakosha l'kmitza yosef minchas chote. Minchas chote is a mincha that has no addition of shemen, of oil. So it's a pure, dry mincha. And to do kmitza, which means that you take these three fingers and you dig into the flour and you catch some flour between the fingers and the palm of your hand. And then what you have to do is you have to smoothen it out so that, anything that is above that which is here is, and in a case where it's a minchas chote, which is totally dry, Rabbi Ilah says this is a very difficult task to do. Inevitably, some of the flour will fall out and so forth and so on. But Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi Omar minchas chote megablo b'mayim ukshera. According to Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi, the Torah does not exclude any mixture of water, because even though the Torah excludes shemen, which would be like a luxury item that's not appropriate for minchas chote for the purpose of chet, but nevertheless, the Torah would allow water. And if you allow water, then this mixture of flour and water uh, is something liquidy, meaning it's substantial that in such a way that he can simply do the kmitza, and therefore the kmitza becomes very easy. What lies at the heart of the machlok of Ila Rabbi Yitzchak Rav Dimi? Mar Sover Kmo Shehem Mesharinon. This is the Havamina of the Gemara. That the machlokas is whether we hold Kmo Shehem Mesharinon or Mar Sover Likmo Shehayu Mesharinon. Again, these two opinions will occupy our minds for the rest of today's blot, even though in this particular context of Minchas Chote, the Gemara is going to reject this, but that doesn't matter because we have to understand these two tzadim in the Gemara. That's going to be the essence of this daf. And that is, whenever the Torah requires a certain measure, a certain volume, do we determine the volume as it is K'mot shahayu? That's the second opinion here. I'm going backwards because K'mot shahayu means in its original form, like we're going to have a case in Truma and Maser of fresh dates, which later on are dried to make dried dates, right? So the fresh dates are called tmorim and the dried dates are called grogros. And what happens is, as a result of the drying process, it shrivels up and it loses volume. So if you hold like this second opinion quoted here, that kemos shahayu, since originally it was larger, it had a greater volume, that's what determines. So, for example, we'll see in Kabbalah's Tumah, we need a volume of a kibetza, and since the tamarim in their natural liquidy state, before they were dried up, they had the nofak, they had the volume of a kibetza, therefore it's makabel tumah. Even if later on you make it into grogeres, you dry them as dried dates, and they no longer have that nefak, they don't have the kibetza. The other Mandiyama says no. Kimot shehem misharina. Whenever the Torah requires a volume, then we look at the volume as it is now, which might mean that it shriveled up and it has less of a volume, or it might mean that it blew up. Let's say, for example, we're going to have a case where you cook something and the meat absorbs the liquid and therefore it blows up and has a larger volume. Then it depends what it is now after you blow it up. And therefore, the Gemara says the following, that Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi, who allows you to add the water into the minchas chote, he holds kemos shehein misharinon, meaning there's kmitza. But before you do the kmitza, add the water to the dough of a minchas chote. Oil is excluded, but water is okay. And as a result, you now have a larger amount of this dough because it's now full of liquid, and it's much easier to do the kmitza in a liquidy dough. And kmot shehein means that even though in its original state, before I added the mincha, it would be very complicated and challenging to achieve the kmitza, but nevertheless, kmot shehein means as they are now. So as long as I add the water, change the original flour into liquidy dough, then he goes in, he does the kmitza, and it's a cinch. Umar Savar, but Rav Ila is of the opinion, kmot shahayu misharina. Let's go back to the moment of the initial natural state of the flour as it was. And that's what the Torah wants for kmitza. The Torah doesn't want any addition of mayim. Look, Gemara says that's not what it's all about. The kuli alma kmot shehem misharina. And that means that even Rav Ila will concede to Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi that we go back to the original. I'm sorry, that Kamot Shehen. Correct. I got it right. That means that even Rav Ilo would agree and concede to Rav Yitzchak, Kamot Shehen. Oh, good. And Kamot Shehen therefore would mean that you don't, right, and therefore you should be able to add the water before the kmitza, because Kamot Shehen, as it is now, after you add the water, and then you go ahead and you do kmitza. No, you can't do that. Why? B'hakam mifli demar savar. Okay, we'll read the Mar Sover of Yitzchak Bar of Dimi, but really I want to just fast forward and then I'll go back again. My Parei v'Charei Mishemen. And Mar Sovar, let's focus on this and then we'll go back. Rav Ila is of the opinion that Chareva, when the Torah describes this mincha v'chote as a mincha chareva, it means to be called dover. It's got to be dry. It's not just to exclude shemen, but to exclude any addition of liquid, including water. So therefore, when Rav Ila says that you can't add the water to the mincha in the case of minchas chote, it's not based on the fact that kimot shahoyu, that we go back to its natural state, but rather it goes back to the fact that chareva excludes any addition of liquid, meaning mayim. Now let's go back to Rabbi Yisrael bar Avdimi. My chareva mishemen. The Torah means to exclude that which applies in the mixture of any other mincha, and that means to exclude shemen. But the Torah is not excluding mayim, and now we're holding that, according to everybody, actually, k'mot shehein misharinon, as it is now. And now he adds the water which he's allowed to add, and that doesn't mafkia the kiyum of chareva, and therefore he could go ahead and do the kmitza after the water was added. And that's the opinion of Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi, who says that there's no great challenge in kmitza of a minchas chot. Okay, now that we've sort of set the framework for this machlokus is kamot shehem or kamot shahayu, so now Tanan Hasam, we're going to learn a Mishnah in Uktzin about Kabbalah's Tuma, where again, as I said earlier, you need a volume of kibetza for an ochel to be Makabal Tuma. Besar ha'egel shenispach. Apparently, when you take the meat of a calf and you cook it, then all of a sudden it swells. And that's called a nofach. Now we have the opposite case. Ubesar's keno shenis moech. Right, a more mature animal, its meat has the volume of kibetza, but then after he cooks it, it's mitztamik. Mitztamik means it shrinks, and it doesn't have a volume of a kibetza. And now the question is, would it be makabel tumah? Would it not be makabel tumah? And the Mishnah in Uktzin establishes that mishtarim l'kmo shehen. In other words, we look at it now, and if we look at it now, well, the meat of the egel swelled up, and as a result of it swelling, it has a shear of an ochel of a kibetza l'kabel tumah, and it will be makabel tumah. On the other hand, we look at the b'sar zakena, and now it's shriveled up, so it has less than a shear of a kibetza, and therefore it's not makabel tumah. So if we read it in that way, then we have a clear-cut indication that the Mishnah maintains k'mot shehem as it is now. And yet, there are three Amoraim against three Amoraim in a controversy over the Kamot Shehein and Kamot Shehoyu. Rav, Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Yochanan Amru, Mishtarin, Kamot Shehein. That we look at it as it is now, and that's how we learned the Mishnah in Uktzin. On the other hand, the Bar Plukta of Rav is Shmuel. And the Bar Plukta of Rabbi Chia is Rav Shimon bar Rebbe. And the Bar Plukta of Rabbi Yochanan is always going to be Reish Lakish. They hold Mishtari Kamot Shehein. And it looks similar if you look at the language. The first shita says Mishtarim Kamot Shehein, and the second says Mishtarim Likamot Shehein. I mean, the only difference is the Lamed, but that's a very significant difference. And Kamot Shehein without a Lamed, which is the first opinion, we're going to call it from now on, just to shorten the breath, we're going to call it Rabbi Yochanan, means Kamot Shehein Achshav, as they are now. What's Likamot Shehein? Somehow the Likamot Shehein goes back to the way they were in their initial natural form. And that's we're going to call Reish Lakish. Now, it's interesting because the Mishnah that we just learned in Uktzin says Mishtarim Likamot Shehein. So that, like, if somehow the prefix of the Lamed magically makes it go back to its original state, then that Mishnah is actually supporting Reish Lakish. Meisvei. So let's see. Besar ha'egel shelo hoybo kashir. Right, it's only after you cook it, then it gets blown up as what we call nispach, and then it becomes a kibetz's worth. So initially lo hayaba kashir, but v'tafach, after he swells it up, amad al kashir, now it has a kibetza. And the Brisa says the following: Tar l'sha'avar v'tamei mikanu lahaba. So in other words, if the Besar ha'egel came in contact with the sheretz in its initial state, then it would not be Makabel Tumah. But if it came in contact with the sheretz after the cooking, when it was nispach, and it was now blown up, and it has a shear of kibetz, so that it is Makabel Tumah. So we see that V'tamei mikanu lahaba would certainly support the sheet of Rabbi Yochanan against Reish Lakish. Why? Because Reish Lakish would say that whether it's not Makabel Tumah is dependent on its original natural state. And the basar of the egel in its natural state did not have a shear of kibetz, so therefore it's never, ever, ever going to be Makabel Tumah. So the Gemara says, you know what? Even Reish Lakish could accept that brisa by saying Rabbanan. The Rabbanan were concerned that if we're going to say that the Basar ha'egel is not Makabel Tumah, and the onlooker sees, wait a minute, it has a shear of kibetza because it's already blown up, then they're going to come to the mistaken conclusion. Therefore, we're going to say that even though technically, according to biblical law, there is no tum over here because the Basar ha'egel was less in its initial state, was less than a kibetza, and we're holding now like Reish Lakish Kamot Shehoyu, Rabbanan asid it, meaning they initiated a tumah. Ihachi frekta Gemara Maseifa. Let's look at the end of the brisa, which says, "V'chein v'pigel v'chein v'nosar." Now, pigel and nosar are deoraises with a chiv kares nonetheless. Oh, so now I just want to point out the shear is no longer kibetza. Kibetza is a shear in ochlin for kabbalas tumah. Here we're talking about the isur nosa, the isur pigel. There the shear is kizayis. So initially, it did not have a kizayis. Now it swells up and it has a kizayis. So again, we're talking about basar of a carbon. If we're holding like Reish Lakish, according to the answer that we gave earlier, that on a Doraisa level, we go back to the original Kvo Shahoy, and the institution of Tuma, in the Kibetza case, after you swelled up the Basar Egel, is only the Rabbanon, then here in this case, since initially the Basar did not have the shear of a Kizayas, and later on it swelled up and it had the shear of Kizayas, then how could you say that there'll be a chiyuv of Nosar or a Pigel because now it has a Kizayas? The Rabbanan never made such an Iser of Nosar or Pigel. Pigel v'Nosar, the Rabbanan Meika, did the Rabbanan ever institute a Chal Shem Iser Pigel or Nosar, which is on a Deraisa level, it's not Pigel, it's not Nosar? We never found such a thing. And therefore, at this point, if we calculate our stance, we still have a kasha on Reish Lakish, who wants to claim that the Rabbanan prohibited something under the Kamot Shehein. It can't work out. So Gemara says, "Ema v'chein betumas pigel v'chein betulas nosar." You're correct. There's no way under the sky that the Rabbanan would institute an Iser Pigel and an Iser Nosar when biblically there is no Iser because of Kamot Shahayu and they didn't have a shear of Kazayas, but rather the subject of this brisa is Tuma. And we have many, many cases where the Rabbanan instituted a din Tuma, and that was exactly what we said about the Basar Egel, that it has a din Tuma, and therefore it's going to have a din of Tumas Pigel and Tumas Nosar. Now, for this, we have to know a little bit more about Pigel and Nosar. I was hoping he would give me a little bit of basic background here. Oh. Now I remember. Yeah. Rashi says this has to do with Tumas Yadayim. Because when the hands come in contact with Pigel and Nosar, there's Tumas Yadayim. And the reason why the Rabbanan could generate a Tumas Yadayim is because they wanted to tell a person who's lazy and he doesn't eat the carbon on time, the basar carbon, and therefore becomes nosar, hey, buddy, you should know that you're going to have tumas yadayim if it becomes nosar. So you might be well advised to prevent it from becoming nosar or a pigel, because otherwise you're going to have this problem of tumas yadayim. Salke daitcha mina hoil v'tumas pigel v'tumas nosar d'Rabbanan. The Rabbanan, as we said before, enacted a tumas yadayim in the case of pigel and nosar for the purpose that we mentioned earlier. Is there for kuli hai the Rabbanan lo ovid Rabbanan? You might think that the Rabbanan are not going to go this far, and they're going to institute a tuma when on a deraisa level there would not be any tuma. Kamashmal and Tana wants to tell me no. The Rabbanan will institute a rabbinic tuma of yadayim in pigel and nosar, even though the Torah would not consider it tuma. Toshma basar zkeino shahayibo kashir. So again, this is a more mature animal, and as far as Kabbalah's tuma is concerned, it's in its original state before they cooked it. It had a shear of kibetza, but somach. Somach means its stomach. Its stomach means it shriveled up. And pachos mikshir, now it has less than a shear. Is tomei l'shavar v'tomei v'tor mikan lahava. And now we're dealing with the doraisa halacha. Now, how the Gemara knows we're dealing with the doraisa halacha? because here it says that it's tar, right? Tar mikan lahaba. From now on, if it comes in contact with tumah, it's tar because now it's mitztamik. And at the present moment, when it came in contact with tumah, it doesn't have a shear of kibetza. That couldn't be rabbinic because the Rabbanan cannot take something that's tameh and make it into tar. Obviously, this is on a deraisa level. It's tahar because right now it's shriveled up and it doesn't have a shear of kibetza. And this would therefore prove the shita of Rabbi Yochanan against Reish Lakish. That's Kamosha Hain. It depends on what it is now. Omar Rabba Kol Hecha de Meikora Havi. Oh, okay. So we got finished with Hakofal. Now Rabba comes and he turns everything upside down. Kol Hecha de Me. So what Rabba is going to do just structurally, we get the structure. He's going to tell you that in one extreme case, there's no machlokus. In the other extreme case, there's no machlokus. And right down the middle, there's going to be a machlokus. If the basar of this kena had a shear of kibetza in its natural state before he cooked it, hashtalespe, but now it shrank, holespe, then even Reish Lakish will agree that it's not makabel tuma. And why? Because now it's shrunk and it doesn't have a kibetza. So if it came in contact with a sheretz, it would not be makabel tuma. So with completely rejecting, according to Rabbi, our initial understanding of Reish Lakish, now we have another case where everybody agrees. Kol hechnebe karlo havibe, in its initial state, it did not have a shear, like for example the case of basar egel. And vahashta, but you cooked it vahavibe, and now it blows up. And therefore, let's just analyze this case. Just 1 second. And according to Reish Lakish, we said, for example, according to Reish Lakish, it would be tar, even if it came in contact with the sheretz now. But the Gemara is going to say min Rabbanon, and it means that even Rabbi Yochanan would accept that on a doraisa level, even though now it has the shear of a kibetza, nevertheless it's not makabel tumah. And that's the exact opposite of what we said about Rabbi Yochanan. Everything's changing. It's very fluid, as we would say. Pardon the pun over here. Midrabana. So what is the machlokes? Ki pligi. Let me just take care of this for a second.